Hey guys, it's Lance at Max Sound Solutions, and today we're going to be testing out the OBSBOT Tiny 3, their new addition to their pan-tilt webcam lineup. And if you have a Mac Mini like I do, it's a great addition because you don't have a webcam if you have a Mac Mini. So these are awesome, and the fact they're pan-tilts make them so useful. I use them all the time. I have two Tiny 2s already, and I use them in all of my videos. And what's great about it, it just sits on your monitor. You can tell it to track you, or you can manually set up your shot, and you don't have to get out of your chair and adjust your tripod on your camera. They're ready to go. You wake them up and you start filming. Really convenient for live streamers, YouTube influencers, and now they have a new lav mic that you can use with the Tiny 3, so you can have a mic on your body and be able to transmit directly to the camera. So that is a really nice addition, and we're going to be testing that out. This is great for people giving a lecture. They can be filmed, they can walk around with their microphone, and the audio, of course, is going to follow them. They also have all these built-in AI features, so we need to check all this stuff out. Let's unbox it and give it a test. And full disclosure, OBSBOT gave me the camera to make the video, so I got it for free, and I do make a small commission on sales if you click my links down below. And as always, thanks for your support. So OBSBOT has really nice packaging, and they do give you a nice little carrying case to protect your camera. So if you want to take it on the go, you get a USB-C cable, and you get a USB-C to USB-A converter, and they give you the little magnetic monitor stand, so you can put that on your monitor and just mount the camera. It's super simple and convenient. And you can see the Tiny 3 on the right is quite a bit smaller than the Tiny 2 on the left. And OBSBOT says it's the world's smallest pan-tilt camera. The Tiny 3's camera does seem to have a wider aperture, even though it's got a slightly smaller sensor. So that's everything in the camera box. Now let's check out the microphone. And again, you get a nice little case for all your microphone items. There's the mic. It's really tiny. Man, you get a USB cable, magnetic clip because it's got a magnet on the back of the mic, so you can use the magnetic clip. They give you a couple of magnets as well, and you get the little dead kitten. Meow. All right, so this is now the Lavalier. Testing 1, 2, 3. I think it sounds really good. I'm quite surprised at the quality of the microphone. It's not making my voice sound really nasal or thin. I don't have any EQ on it. I have a slight amount of noise reduction. I've got it on the weak mode. It's got 3 different settings for noise reduction, and I think it sounds pretty darn good. And so, you know, it's a Bluetooth connection to the microphone, so I can move around the room and my audio quality is going to remain the same. Whereas with my stationary mic, of course, you're going to start hearing a lot more of the room. But with this, I can walk around, give a presentation, the camera's going to follow me, and the audio is going to be right there. So that is pretty nice. Okay, we're going to quickly just test out the internal mics on the camera. They have new mic array in there, and they've got a bunch of different AI settings. So this is pure audio. This is straight up, no processing. Now we're going to go to spatial audio mode. Definitely kicked in noise reduction, and you don't get the noise reduction settings anymore once you go using the internal microphone. And then we're going to go to smart omni mode. So we're in smart omni. And how does that sound? 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3. Then we're going to go into directional mode. And this is the one I think sounds the best. It's using noise reduction. The voice is still pretty clear. You're not picking up a lot of room tone. It's pretty good. Definitely good enough for your Zoom calls and things of that nature. And then we've got dual directional mode. And let's see. This is dual directional. I'm going to go over here. I'm behind the camera now for dual directional mode. Test 1, 2, 3. And now we're back in front of the camera, testing 1, 2, 3. With the Tiny 3, you can record up to 120 frames per second in 1080p. So if you want to do some slow motion effects, you can do it. And you can record in portrait mode for your TikToks. So we're going to have a quick look at the software with Tiny 3 because it has changed. Tiny 3 has more options. I got 3 cameras working. So I got Tiny 2, Tiny 3, and over here I got another Tiny 2. And we're just going to go back to this angle. So I'm doing a screen capture, but I'm also recording Tiny 3 camera independently. In the OBSBOT Center app, it's where you totally control your camera. So you got your console. This is where you can come in here and pan the camera around, right? Or you can have it track you automatically. Yeah, it's tracking me. So I can turn that on and off and manually track it. So what's nice about this, I can also zoom in. I can zoom back out. And you have voice gestures. You can use hand gestures, like it's going to zoom in on me now. And then I can undo that. That's nice. The other thing is the microphone has a button that you can set for different functions. So you can click it to start recording, or you can click it to have the camera track you. So that's very cool. I mean, the amount of tech that's rolled into these tiny little cameras is pretty insane. And the software keeps getting better. So I'm in pretty much manual mode for the video settings, for the camera settings, except for autofocus. I do have auto white balance on because that's easy and that doesn't shift around if you're in a preset lighting situation. But I can come down here and tweak the contrast and the sharpness, go way too sharp or not very sharp. When you're in auto white balance, you can still go in there and tweak it, which is really nice. Get it just where you want it. And then of course you can turn auto white balance off and go set your color temperature that way. But I'm finding I like the auto white balance on with a little bit of a tweak, at least for this setting that I'm in right now. You have total manual control of the camera, which very few webcams give you that functionality. So it's really nice that they have that. You're not just locked into whatever the camera gives you. And you know, with these, you can record multiple tinies into OBS and use it for live streaming. So under more, you have all these microphone settings that we went through before and your voice control for waking up the camera and putting it to sleep. I could say sleep Tiny. Hi Tiny. So that's cool. I'm still recording and you can see I've got the external microphone selected. That's important. You want to select the external mic and then you can also adjust your gain. And you've got settings for your LED, auto power off, microphone status. So I guess if you put the camera to sleep, the microphone is going to go to sleep also. Microphone status during sleep. Noise reduction is off right now. I'm going to put it on weak. So we have a little bit of noise reduction now, but not too strong. But obviously if you're in a noisy environment, you could go with medium or strong. When you go back to image, you have the beauty effects, which if I click on that, that's a little preview. Now to get the beauty to actually go out live, you have to use the virtual camera output, not the stock camera. So you have to switch or select virtual Tiny 3 as opposed to Tiny 3 when you're in OBS, and then you can add effects like this.
Oh my. There they are, yellow. It's a miracle. Nice white teeth, folks. And I didn't have to go to the dentist. Too much coffee over the years.
And you can tweak all kinds of stuff in here. Face, body, makeup, your eyes. You can whiten your teeth. So I'm going to turn that off. That just gives you an idea of what you can do. If you're recording with the OBSBOT Center app, you can put these effects on right away and record with them. You don't have to use the virtual camera, but you get the idea. You got all kinds of tweakable stuff for your face and your body. You know, it does all kinds of stuff. And you also have some filters here to give you different looks. Film, black and white, went completely black and white. So just like with the Tiny 2, you have all these effects. It also has an HDR switch, which gives you more dynamic range. There it is off. Let's see if it brightens up my mixing board a little bit because that's in the dark. Yeah. Brought in a little more mixing console, so we'll leave HDR on for now. You've got a lot of tools to work with these tiny little cameras, and it's gotten tinier, and I think the image quality has gotten really good. And so along with the release of the new Tiny 3 camera, they've added some new functionality to the OBSBOT Center app. One is you have a built-in teleprompter now, which it didn't used to have. So you can go in there, drop your script in, and use the teleprompter right in front of you on the screen. So that is a really nice option. Secondly, they have digital avatars. So with an additional software, you can run a digital avatar during your session and you don't need to be on camera yourself. And then thirdly, they have RTC, which allows you to remotely control an online session. So you can do things like pan tilt your cameras, use the AI features of locking in on a subject, things of that nature, remote control your online meetings.
All right, guys, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel. Check out this video. Give me the thumbs up, and I will see you on the next Max Sound Solutions video.